be participating in the Lord's Supper together. And so if you were able to grab the elements when you came in, that's fantastic. If not, we want to help you out here. And so we would invite everyone to participate, even if you're not a member here and you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, and you're in good standing with your church, even if you have to be visiting with us, if you're in good standing with your church, then we would, once again, welcome you to participate with us. And so if you did not get one of these, deacons, go ahead and stand up. We have some of our deacons scattered across the room. And if you'll just raise your hand, we would love to make sure you get one. And you may have to keep your hand up just for a minute so they can see where you are. But just keep those hands raised, and we'll make sure you get one. Right down front here. Raise them high. There we go. Well, currently we have a team that's out on mission that we've sent out through West Jackson, and it is over in Middle Tennessee. And so they are a group of our college students, and our college pastor, Joey Cadden, is over there, and they're working with First Baptist Antioch, and they've been undergoing all kinds of things. It's really just a weekend trip, but we're excited just for the different things that they've been doing. A few pictures here to show you. I think we have a few more. It looks like they're doing some construction. These guys, I don't know if they know what they're doing with this door, but I'm just going to assume somebody told them what they're supposed to do with this door. And anyway, some unique ministry opportunities there, so we're thankful they were able to be a part of that. And just want to always make you aware when we're out on mission somewhere. That's part of the DNA of our church. We are a gospel community on a mission. We believe the gospel is not something that's meant to stop with us, but it's meant to be shared with others. And so they're doing that this weekend. As we are in here this morning, like I said, we're going to participate in the Lord's Supper together, and we're going to look at the passage this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 9. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn to 2 Samuel 9. If you don't have a Bible, there's one there in the pew, and that's there for you to use. We'd love for you to take it out and open up to 2 Samuel 9. And if you need some help finding this passage in the pew Bible, it's on page 269. And my goal this morning, as we get into this text, is to help us understand what it means as we gather together and take the Lord's Supper. You know, 2,000 years ago, when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, they gathered around the table the night he was going to be arrested, before he was going to be crucified the next day. And he gave them a picture of what was going to take place, his broken body and his shed blood. But he did so around a table. And when I think about the Lord's Supper, what we're doing here, I want you to have that image in your mind. Now, granted, we can't all get around a table, but as we participate in this together, I want us to think about gathering around a table. And just consider, as we all are here, participating, the many different stories that exist across this room. The many different journeys that people have taken, these stories of God's grace in your life. I think we would be amazed at all that God has done in the lives of the people in this room. And just imagine coming around this table and sharing our stories, these many different stories. Well, this morning from 2 Samuel, I want to share with you a story of grace found around a table, a royal table, in fact. This table is the royal table of King David, the greatest king of Israel. In the Old Testament, David was a shadow of Jesus, right? The eternal king. But David in the Old Testament, he was the greatest king of them all. And particularly here in 2 Samuel chapter 9, he's the greatest king in the land, all the land. And if you look back, if you turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 8, this is what chapter 8 is all about. He's giving us some context, the writer's giving us some context about how vast David's kingdom is. At this point, God had allowed David to subdue all the enemies of Israel. Now, this was something Saul, the previous king, was unable to do. But God did this through David, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Arameans. All these, God gave David victory over. And as he did so, he accumulated an incredible amount of wealth. In fact, in 1 Chronicles, tells us it was equal to 7.5 million pounds of gold and 75 million pounds of silver. That's a lot of wealth. And if you wonder, Solomon, David's son, was known as the wealthiest man who ever lived. Well, if you want to know where his wealth came from, it came from David. David took all these articles from his victory, all this wealth, and kept it. He knew ultimately it belonged to the Lord. And so David was powerful, he was wealthy, and he was living in a very extravagant palace. And so you can imagine the king's table that they would have gathered around in the palace wasn't just for anybody. It was only for the family. It was only for distinguished guests. And some of these we have mentioned at the end of chapter 8. Look at the end of chapter 8 there, those last few verses, and look at verse 15. It begins by talking about Joab. Joab was the head military commander over the army. And then you have Jehoshaphat, who was the court historian. And then Zadok and Ahimelech were priests. And then Sariah was the court secretary. And then Benaiah was a legendary military hero. And he was over what you might consider the secret service of David. And then beyond them, you have David's sons, who were his chief officials, men like Amnon, and who was David's oldest son, and Absalom, who is another one of his sons, who was gathered in the palace around King David's table. These were the good-looking people, okay? These were the people who had it all together. These are the people who were in the Jerusalem VIP. You know what I'm saying? Everybody tries to get in that VIP and just can't get in there. And just the important people make it in the VIP, and that's what we would expect around a table that was in King David's palace. All the people that were around this table were there because they had royal blood, they were relatives of David, or they possessed some incredible skill, right? They somehow attained great honor before the king. All of them, except for one. Except for one. Have you ever been in a place where you know you didn't belong? I think I've told this before. Years ago, when I was a student pastor, a friend invited me and a couple other guys to go to the AT&T Stadium, the home of the Dallas Cowboys, and his uncle had a son that was wealthy. He was an oil man and just had all kinds of money, and he actually owned a suite there at the Cowboys Stadium. And so we were invited to, we were invited to go to the suite, and they also had these 50-yard line tickets that were just amazing. And I remember gathering there in the suite, and it was field level. And there were other people there. We never even met his son. We knew the uncle. But as we were in that little suite, it became really apparent quickly that we were out of our league, right? You had these billionaires that were gathered there. They had these oil companies, and we would try to strike up conversations with them. They're like, "What do you do?" And we'd be like, "Well, I'm a youth pastor." Right? In the kingdom, I think a very important job, right? But in this world's eyes, that's not too important. And so as we were walking around, we discovered we didn't have much to say to these people, not much in common. And so me and this other guy, we began to stick all the hot dogs in our pockets and all the freebies, and then we went out to our 50-yard line tickets. But I never will forget feeling so out of place in that moment. And here, as you think about King David's table with all these people that were once again, the most important people in the kingdom, ultimately in the world, as you think about David's, his rule, the most famous king in the land, and yet here around his table, there was one person who you would never expect. In fact, you might even say he didn't belong. And his name was Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth didn't hold any kind of special office for the king. He served no real strategic purpose. If anything, you might consider him a detriment. Like he had nothing to offer King David, but ultimately he needed something from King David. You see, Mephibosheth was crippled. He was lame in both feet. And he couldn't help the king. He had to be helped by the king. He was not in the bloodline of David either. In fact, Mephibosheth was actually in the family line of the late King Saul, who was one of King David's greatest enemies. Mephibosheth's grandfather, Saul, tried to kill David, tried to assassinate David. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul. And really, at this point in time, the only remaining relative in Saul's line of descendants. And Mephibosheth's story, it actually starts with tragedy. He wasn't born crippled in both feet. When he was 5 years old, his grandfather, then King Saul, and his father, Jonathan, and ultimately the rest of Saul's sons were killed in a battle against the Philistines. One survived, but then he was murdered. They suffered this crushing defeat, and as Saul and his sons are being killed, the family knew that the Philistines would come after them next, and so the royal family had to flee the palace. And as they were fleeing the palace, Mephibosheth fell. His nanny was helping him along, and somehow he fell, and as he fell, he injured both of his feet, a permanent injury. Now, we don't know how much of his story from this point on. We don't know much about his story from this point on, except that eventually he ended up in a town called Lodabar, and he must have been under the care of others. And just because of his past history, in fact, his name, it means kind of the scatterer of shame. And I would imagine that's how Mephibosheth felt. As he's there in the town, this town, Lodabar, means nothing or nowhere. He's living in this town of nowhere, experiencing the shame of having lost everything, trying to forget what happened. But you can imagine as he's trying to forget his past, all he had to do is look down at his feet, and he would be reminded, right, of all that he had lost, of life in the palace. He had lost his father at the age of 5, his grandfather, his family. Mephibosheth had lost everything. And the best he could do at this point in time was to try to remain forgotten. And that's where we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 9. David asked, "Is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake?" There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba, and they summoned him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "I am your servant," he replied. So the king asked, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show kindness of God to?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still Jonathan's son who is injured in both feet." And the king asked him, "Where is he?" And Ziba answered the king, "You'll find him in Lodabar at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel." So King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down, and paid homage. David said, "Mephibosheth, I am your servant," he replied. So get the picture here. Mephibosheth is carried before the most powerful man in the world. And notice his posture here as he's brought before King David. He bows down. He puts his head down. Here is a man, Mephibosheth. He's expecting wrath. He's expecting punishment. Ultimately, I think he's expecting to be executed here. Right? And that's kind of our natural inclination. If you get called to the principal's office or your boss's office, what do you immediately begin to think? You don't think you're coming there for some kind of commendation. More than likely, you feel like it's just natural, right? Just this natural inclination. We feel like we're about to be in trouble. And here, Mephibosheth had every reason to feel this way. Because typically, when a new king takes the throne, that one of the first things he does is goes around and executes all possible rivals. And this would have included all the descendants from the previous king. And so you can imagine Mephibosheth, right? He is the grandson of the former King Saul, who, once again, was David's enemy, who tried to kill David. Surely David would want to make sure Mephibosheth was no future threat. And so you can imagine how he must have felt when one day, after all these years of living in enmity and then trying to be forgotten, when all of a sudden he gets word that the king wants him to come to the palace. Could you imagine the fear that must have gripped his heart as he began to think David must finally be ridding himself of the last remaining heir of Saul? And so Mephibosheth was carried from Lodabar to Jerusalem. Right? What else could this be about? Certainly he was about to die. Let's pick it up there in verse 7. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table." Mephibosheth paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you take an interest in a dead dog like me?" So once again, you see here, Mephibosheth goes there expecting to be punished, for his life to be taken, and yet David says, "Don't be afraid." Those were not words that he expected to hear. And he said, "I've brought you here not to execute you, but to show you kindness." And notice what this kindness is going to include. It's going to include restoration. We'll see that King David is going to give him all of his grandfather Saul's land and all his belongings. Even Saul was going to give Mephibosheth Saul's servants, Ziba, and Ziba's sons and his servants who would work the land for Mephibosheth. And then finally, in an interesting turn, David not only restores all these belongings to Mephibosheth, but he does something unimaginable. He invites him to join him at the royal table. And not just for a meal. This is not just a pity invite. Hey, come on, I need to do this, get this over with. No, he says from now on, Mephibosheth, you will sit at my table. Just as my own children eat and belong at the royal table, from now on, Mephibosheth, you too will also. Now, can you imagine Mephibosheth's response? I mean, you could see there from his response, he's overwhelmed. He said, "What in the world why would you do this for me? I'm like a dead dog." Remember, dogs in these days were despised, okay? He's not talking about a dead golden doodle here, okay? He's talking about a street rat. That was basically a dog, all right? And he said, "Listen, why would you do this for me? I'm a dead dog, right, in your eyes. Why would you go and bother to go this far out of your way to find me," right? Because David goes looking for him, and then to bring me here and to show me this kind of kindness, right? That you would allow me to sit at your table from this day forward and inconvenience you in this way, right? He has nothing to offer you. If anything, he can only take away from you. The most Mephibosheth can be at this point is a nuisance to David. And yet notice what David's response is. He says, "I'm doing this because of your father, Jonathan." David is making good on a promise, on a covenant that he made with Mephibosheth's dad, Jonathan, the son of King Saul. Continue reading there in verse 9. He goes on to say, "Then the king summoned Saul's attendant and Ziba and said to him, 'I have given to your master's grandson all that belonged to Saul and his family. You, your sons, and your servants are to work the ground for him, and you are to bring in the crops so your master's grandson will have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, is always to eat at my table.' Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And Ziba said to the king, 'Your servant will do all my lord the king commands.' So Mephibosheth ate at David's table just like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all those living in Ziba's house were Mephibosheth's servants. However, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He had been injured. His feet had been injured." You know, when you think about this story, if Mephibosheth were here, his story would be this, that he was living in a nowhere town. His existence was shameful. I mean, when you saw him, this injured man, the only thing he represented was the image of a past king who was evil, who ended up being disgraced, who ultimately lost the throne of Israel. His story would have been that he was fatherless, right? And he was injured in both feet, and his life was going nowhere until one day he was carried into the presence of the king and shown kindness and grace because of the life of another. And he was given a seat at the table and eating with the sons of the king. As we gather here this morning around this table, I think each one of us, in a way, we have a story like Mephibosheth. In other words, Mephibosheth's story is like your story, and it's like my story. The fact that you're here participating and taking the Lord's Supper, that you're fellowshipping at the table of the King is no less dramatic, no less amazing, should be no less surprising that you would be here and be able to participate at this table. Do you see that? See, there's some things about Mephibosheth that we look at him that are true of him, and we feel sorry for him, but honestly, they're true of us as well. Often in ways that we have forgotten. So my heart this morning is that you would be stirred again to see the wonder and the amazement that you were here, that you were around the table of the king. See, like Mephibosheth, we are all broken. Every one of us, we're broken. There's a physical brokenness that some have, but we're all broken. And sometimes it's easier to see than others, but it doesn't mean you're not broken. There's not a one of us that has gotten ourselves here, right? There's not a one of us here that has pulled ourselves up by our bootstrap and changed our life, and all of a sudden we've made ourselves worthy of participating in this table. I love what he says there at verse 13. It's almost like at the end of the story, the writer's emphasizing this point. He says, there was this man Mephibosheth, and from here on he lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. Once again, he said that a couple of times already. And then he reminds us at the same time that his feet had been injured. It's like, don't forget this, right? Here's the story of Mephibosheth. He's restored. He's brought to the king's table. Don't forget these things, these two things. Number one, he's here at this table forever. This is a permanent invitation. He's eating now as one of the sons of the king, but also don't forget that his 2 feet are injured. And it's almost as if he's helping us see that these two things, they don't go together. Like eating at the king's table like a son, and yet being the crippled son of one of the king's enemies, those two things shouldn't go together. Yet this is the reality for us this morning as well. Do you know that you and I, right? Romans 5 says that we were enemies of God. That before you came to know God through Jesus Christ, that it's not that you were just out there being neutral. No, you were an enemy of God. You belong to a rival kingdom. You belong to the ruler of this world. That we were doing his bidding. And then Ephesians 2 says that we were following, right, this kingdom of the world, and we were objects of God's wrath. Like we should have been executed. We should have felt the wrath of the king because we were his enemies. But the reality is that even though we are enemies of the King and we are objects of his wrath, right? We all find ourselves at this table, not because of anything we have done. No, we could do nothing for ourselves. We were broken, unable to get ourselves here. And my friends, we need to remember that as we gather here this morning. That apart from Christ, we were his enemy. We were object of God's wrath. We were broken. We didn't know God. We didn't want God. Many of you are familiar with Joni Eareckson Tada. She's quadriplegic and had a diving accident at a young age, and has been bound to a wheelchair her whole life, and has been an incredible advocate for those who were disabled. And not too long ago, she hosted a conference, and she commissioned a man by the name of Hyatt Moore to paint a picture of the great banquet in Luke chapter 14, where the master of the banquet invites these people who are broken to come into his house to this feast. And this is the picture that he painted. You can see Jesus here. But all around this table you see people. Now, I don't know about the dog. I don't go that far, okay? I don't know about the dog there. But all around this table that belongs to King Jesus are broken people. My friends, this is a picture of the church. You do realize this, don't you? Like that even though you may not physically be broken, your feet may be just fine. But to be at the table of King Jesus means to admit that you're broken. Means that you admit that you're a sinner, that you're messy, that you're unable to help yourself. So if you're here this morning and you're well aware of your sin, my friends, it doesn't exclude you from the table. In fact, it's the only way that you can arrive at the table is to be aware of your sin and to admit that you're broken. Not only are we all broken, but we've all been rescued by grace. That's another thing for those of us who find ourselves around the table of the Lord that we have in common, is that we have all been rescued by grace. Just as Mephibosheth had no ability to take himself to the king's palace, he had no right to sit at that table, neither do we. We're unable to get ourselves there. We have no right to be there. Mephibosheth was the recipient of grace that was secured by another, his father Jonathan. And if you turn back to 1 Samuel, you'll see how this took place. Jonathan's father, Saul, wanted to take David's life because he knew David, the Lord was raising up David to be the king. And Jonathan, instead of siding with his father, he understood the Lord's will and he loved David and he committed himself to David. And then to the point where he was willing to give up his own right to the throne. He was willing to give up his rightful place. And in 1 Samuel chapter 20, this is what Jonathan says to David. He says, "If I die, don't ever withdraw your faithful love from my household, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." Jonathan says, don't forget me. Don't ever withdraw your faithful love. That word faithful love, it's a common Hebrew word. It's translated kindness in the book of Ruth. We talked about a lot about kindness, but it means God's covenant kindness, his covenant faithfulness, his covenant love. And it's interesting, that same Hebrew word, hesed, is found here in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7. This is exactly what David is saying here in verse 7. He says, don't be afraid, since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. Don't be afraid, because I'm going to show you that this covenant love. I made a covenant with your father Jonathan. And that covenant exists today, right? You are covered by this covenant. So I'm going to show you my steadfast love. I'm going to show you my loyal love, my unfailing love. This steadfast kindness, it would have been the highest virtue in the Hebrew society. And you know who else this word is used to speak of in Scripture more than anybody else? God himself. This Hebrew word hesed, which means that, right, this steadfast, loyal love, it describes God more than any other character in Scripture. In Exodus chapter 34, it says, the writer says this: the Lord is compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love. That steadfast love, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. That is the kind of covenantal love that God has for his people. And then Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9, he goes on, it says, know that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps his gracious covenant, loyalty for 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commands. And so just as David was keeping his covenant, he was showing the steadfast kindness to Mephibosheth, someone who didn't deserve it, couldn't even come and receive it. He had to be brought to David. He did this because of the covenant he made with Jonathan. So God's love for you is by grace. It's been won not for anything that you and I have done, but it's come through the death of another. In fact, as we take the Lord's Supper, one of the things that we'll often say, one of the phrases that you'll hear when we drink the cup, because these are the words of Jesus himself. He said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. As Jonathan's death brought a grace to his son Mephibosheth and put him in a place that he never thought he would be, so is the death of Jesus and his blood shed for you, his body broken for you. You have received grace, once again, that you did not deserve. And God's covenant kindness, his steadfast love, his unfailing love is now upon you through the death of his perfect, his one and only Son. You and I were not worthy. We're not worthy to be at this table, but Jesus has made us worthy. And you have to wonder, when David would look down at Mephibosheth, sitting at that king's table, I just have to imagine that he was constantly reminded of Jonathan, the love of Jonathan. And so it is, I think, when God looks at us as his table, he is reminded of his son, Jesus. For we have been brought to this table through the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So we have been rescued by grace. Then finally, I would say this: we all have a seat at the king's table, always. Always. When we take the Lord's Supper together, rightly so, we often reflect on the death of Jesus, his crucifixion, and certainly we should. It symbolizes that very thing. But not only are we is the Lord's Supper to remind us of his death in the past, it's also to remind us of our hope in the future. In fact, Jesus did this on the night that he took the Lord's Supper. In Matthew chapter 26, Verse 29, he says this to his disciples as they're gathered around the table. He says, "But I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And so as we take the Lord's Supper, once again, we're not just to reflect on and understand the great love God has for us, displayed and proven in the death of his son, but we're also to remember that Jesus was raised from the dead and now is in heaven, and the promise for all who believe is that this Lord's Supper is just a taste of what's to come. Right? Heaven is about feasting with God around the table. Heaven is about being invited to the King's table and experiencing his goodness forever. That's the hope that we have in this around this table. And when you think about the Lord's Supper, it is a foretaste of this reality. And so certainly we can understand the great love of God that God has for us by thinking and reflecting on his death. But even beyond that, we can have hope and be encouraged and have joy in our hearts, because we know that even though in this life we will face struggles, even in this life we will still walk in our brokenness, one day there's a hope that we'll be healed forever. When you think about Mephibosheth sitting at that table, I would imagine he would look down at his feet and he could have thought this: nothing's changed. My feet are still broken. Nothing's changed. But in reality, everything had changed. Everything. And so it is for you in your brokenness. In whatever way that you feel that in your heart and in your life, your sin, your circumstances, your situation, your dreams that have fallen flat, you can look down and see that you're still broken. But don't forget, everything has changed. Everything. It's interesting, a little while later, Mephibosheth and his servant Ziba would have a disagreement. We don't have time to get into the story. But David sought to divide what he had given Mephibosheth. And so he said, Ziba, I'm going to give you half of all that I've given Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, you can have the other half. And I loved Mephibosheth's response. He says, you know what? I don't need it. Ziba can have it all as long as I can sit at your table. I'm not worried about all these fields and this wealth as long as I can sit at your table. Mephibosheth never got over sitting at the king's table. My prayer is that you don't either. That you would understand your brokenness, that you would once again embrace the grace, the incredible grace that God has given you through his Son, Jesus Christ. And that you would remember that you have a seat at the King's table for eternity. And that changes everything. I want to invite you to take your cup. And I want to invite you to look in, as we take this together this morning, I want to invite you to look in three different directions. The first direction is I want you to look in. I want you to think about your own life, your own brokenness. Think about the shame that you may feel, that you may be even carrying this morning. And would you just speak that to the Lord right now? And then I want to invite you to look back. Not only look in, but to look back. Right? You have your brokenness. That's it. But when you look back, you see a God who has loved you and sent his son to be broken, to have his blood shed for you. And that's enough for you. Believe that. The way to deal with your shame and your brokenness is not by pretending that it's not there. It's not by doing something to make it right. It's by trusting. It's by looking back and trusting in the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus for your sin. So would you just do that for a minute? On the night Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it and he gave thanks. And he said, "Eat this in remembrance of me." The same way he took the cup and he said, "This cup is my shed blood. It's the new covenant shed for the forgiveness of sins." Drink. And now I want to invite you to look one more direction. All right, we've looked in, we've looked back. And now I think the Lord's Supper also invites us to look forward, to know that this is just a taste of what's ahead. So we gather here every Sunday and we celebrate the good news of the gospel. That's just a foretaste of all that's in store for those who have trusted in Jesus Christ. And so in a response this morning, listen, if you've never made that step, if you're here today and you just kind of came to church and you thought maybe something will change in my life because I'm here, or you know you need a change in your life, listen, being in this building by itself, coming to a worship service cannot save you, cannot change you. Listen, you have to trust in Jesus Christ. He is the one who brings about change. He is the one who gives new life. And so if you've never trusted in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and you would come and say, "I know I'm broken. I want to be made. I want to be healed." It's through Christ's broken body that we are healed. So I would invite you to come and place your faith, to trust in Jesus. If you've already done that this morning, I would encourage you just to sing out, to look ahead and praise God for the hope that we have. Right? Maybe nothing's changed here right now, but everything ultimately, everything that matters, ultimately matters, has changed. So we can celebrate that together. Our pastors will be down front. We'd love to pray with you, to listen to you. Let's stand and sing. You respond as we sing.